Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Scorpion Media Podcast. It's the seventh episode to date, and it's going to be a great one. I'm your host, Jordan, and today I'm joined by my good friend and longstanding co-host, Jacob. We're expecting that a good friend of ours, Rafael, will join the podcast soon, which will actually be his first appearance ever, which is going to be quite exciting. And what makes this episode even more exciting is that we're joined today by Charlie Looker, musician, essayist, writer, philosopher, and theorist, and all around brilliant, creative guy who we're very grateful to have on the podcast today. So thank you, Charlie. Now, as is always the case with this podcast, we begin by giving our guests the opportunity to introduce themselves to the Scorpion Movement audience. What they do, their background, what they've produced or made over the years, what they're notable for, their passions and interests, anything else along those lines. So, Charlie, if you'd like to introduce yourself to the audience along those lines or along the other, then feel free to do so with as much detail and with as much depth as you'd like. So go
Yeah,
ahead.
right on. What's up, everyone? I'm Charlie Looker. First off, a musician, guitar player, singer, composer from New York, born and raised. And, I wouldn't call myself a philosopher, but that's cool that you would give me that title or credit. And essayist, yeah, maybe I write a little bit. I'll own that. And yeah, I'm an internet person. Well, I run the Last Things podcast and YouTube channel where I do stuff that's some of it's similar to what Scorpion is doing, different in other ways, mostly music, but some philosophy and yeah.
Yeah, perfect. So we began our last podcast by asking our guest about their personal background, their childhood, adolescence, teenagehood, etc., and how it may have influenced their development and what they decided to pursue later on in life. And I'd like to take the same approach here. And the reason I like to do that is because, as I've stated before, and as has been the case more often than not, just anecdotally speaking, in terms of what I've encountered in my life, it can often be difficult to completely detach one's interests and pursuits throughout adulthood from their experiences and interests as an adolescent or as a young adult growing up. So, on that note, were there any formative experiences during your early years that you think shaped your future development and pursuits later on in life? Any influences or activities that you stumbled upon that seemed especially significant to you in hindsight, whether it's a piece of music, a band, a song, a person, an event, just anything that made you into the person that you are today, broadly speaking.
Yeah. Well, I guess probably my father teaching me the piano when I was a very little kid, sort of forcing me to play the piano. I did not really like it, but I was very good at it. And he really taught me a work ethic, a very serious work ethic. And he taught me, a certain sense of responsibility of, this idea of like, if you're good at something, you have to do it, which is not actually, objectively true 100% of the time. But yeah, the sense of, you're able to do this thing, you have responsibility to do what you're good at and bring it to the world, not waste your talent and your abilities. So that was funny. I'm naming my dad a lot. Probably my dad getting me into Twin Peaks when I was 10. That probably, because that was on the air. I'm that generation. So it was like, I was born in '80, so this is like 1990. So yeah, that probably got me into weird aesthetics, kind of darkness, and I don't know, formative things. I saw the older kids with Metallica t-shirts. It looked right up my alley at 10 or 11. I got And Justice for All, and I remember the fade in of the backwards guitar stuff from Blackened. I remember hearing that for the first time. I remember the riff for Blackened kicking in. I wish I could feel something like that again. You don't get that again. It doesn't come back. That's.
Was there anything, of Twin Peaks, was there anything more on the experimental or avant-garde side that you got into at an early age, or would you say that you eased yourself into that over time? So you started out maybe with I guess the somewhat more mainstream artists like Metallica, which I assume got you into thrash, maybe into metal, and then from there, did you start getting into more experimental or just more extreme music because you wanted to see what else was out there? Essentially, would you describe it as something like that?
Yeah, yeah, I would. I mean, well, if you haven't heard Metallica before, that's avant-garde. I mean, it's they weren't playing music that heavy on the radio, at least that I had heard. So that's already an avant-garde thing. You see the T-shirt, you're like, that's threatening. I want to know about it. That's mysterious. I want to know what that is. The older kids are into some kind of secret, that I'm not in on. So I want to know. And yeah, but yeah, actually, metal did. Was metal the way into? Well, metal and jazz are kind of my ways into the avant-garde. Because it was like, yeah, I got into jazz soon after that through my guitar teacher because I started playing guitar when I was 11, right? So my dad was like, I'll let you quit piano in a couple of years, and I'll give you I'll get you guitar and guitar lessons if you keep playing piano for another couple of years. So. Yeah, and then my teacher got me into jazz too. So then it's like that jazz and metal both were like the two-pronged thing of like, I want to find the most extreme, weird versions of both of these things. So, thrash metal became death metal and grindcore and black metal. And then jazz, became just from bebop, Ornette Coleman, and then Cecil Taylor. And then we're in that. And then we're in that realm.
You mentioned those two genres or subgenres, extreme metal and jazz artists like Ornette Coleman, because the next the logical progression from there, what you could describe as the fusion of those two subgenres, would be artists like Naked City and John Zorn. And I know you mentioned your interest in those types of guys, and obviously I want to touch on the New York City scene and the downtown scene later on in this podcast, but
Yeah.
obviously figures like John Zorn are really influential in that scene, and I think he definitely encouraged and I would say influenced musicians in both realms, the artier side of metal and the artier side of jazz, to be more open to each other's contributions. And then you had some really interesting fusions that arose as a result of that. So it's interesting that you touch on that. But would you say, with that in mind, would you say that you came from the background of a musical family? Like, were anyone in your family music teachers or anything like that? I mean, how receptive were they to these pursuits?
Quite receptive. My dad plays piano pretty well, and he played clarinet as a kid. But he's a psychiatrist, and my mom's a psychologist. So, yeah. But he plays jazz and classical and stuff, and he knows a little bit about jazz and stuff. And he took me to my first concert, which I begged him to take me to, but which was Megadeth and Slayer. When I was 11, so he took me to that. So he was supportive. And yeah, Zorn was big for me, man. And so that's another thing, I'm a musician to the core, and I'm New York to the core, for sure. Also going to like hardcore matinees and stuff at CBGB's and stuff like that. But, I found out about Zorn because I was going to see Faith No More when I was in 9th grade. And I kind of knew Patton was supposedly into some weird stuff, but I didn't know. And then some people were like, yo, like he's playing a secret show later tonight with the saxophone player, just doing noise shit with the saxophone player. Like, go check this out, let's go follow him down to this place called the Knitting Factory. And so then I saw Zorn and Patton do like a noise duo. And that was the first time I heard something where I was like, yeah, that is not just a more extreme version of stuff I know. I'm like, that is actually, I don't know what I'm listening to. This is confusing. The feeling of being confused. Yeah.
That can be an addictive feeling in a sense. So actually, like that addiction to confusion and the out there and the bizarre. Actually, that at least that's what I've experienced in my life. But it's interesting that you bring up these artists like Mike Patton, because obviously he was in Mr. Bungle, which is a great band. I mean, I'm sure you've heard of them. But it's fascinating how all of these intersections and I guess kind of unexpected commonalities keep popping up, because you mentioned Twin Peaks earlier, and by the way, David Lynch, amazing director, obviously. I love everything that he does, and he actually has some really interesting philosophical themes as well, which we're going to touch on philosophy, of course. But I'm pretty sure that he actually influenced Mr. Bungle in a sense. I mean, that's something that I've thrown around a lot. And I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
yeah,
They use quotes from him and even samples and stuff. Yeah.
yeah, the guys in Mr. Bungle were super eclectic in terms of their taste. I mean, they were borrowing. I'm not sure how many people realize that. Maybe more do nowadays, just because of the internet and it's easier to research now. But they were borrowing from so many different aesthetic sources, not just music. Like film and
Yeah.
literature. And I don't know. Do you know Trace Bruance very well? I think he was their guitarist.
I know who. I mean, a bunch of couple of the people who are in Extra Life now played in Secret Chiefs 3, so they know him. And Trevor Dunn, the bass player, is a friend of mine. We've played together a little bit. So
Yeah, yeah, he's a fascinating guy too. I read an interview with him, and he was talking about his interest in things like Islamic theology and like problems with the Big Bang Theory, and he's just a
yeah,
guy, and I think that actually that definitely manifested in Mr. Bungle's aesthetics and in their lyrics and their music as well. And so yeah, that's another intersection actually of this weird theory, these weird intellectual pursuits with this type of avant-garde music. That seems to be a recurring theme here, and we can touch on that in more detail, obviously. But with that in mind, now obviously, as I'm sure anyone who follows you is well aware of, you're a very prolific musician. You got so many projects under your belt: Extra Life, Z's, Psalm Zero. I'm a huge fan of your collaborations with you, like Mick Barr, Dirty Projectors, Colin Marston. He's one of my favorites. I've tried to get him on the podcast before. Hopefully he accepts one day. Many more people, and um, I definitely want to touch on some of these specific projects, like Extra Life, for instance.
sure.
But for now, and I know we've already talked about this briefly, if you could just walk us through your maybe your musical trajectory and your main creative and musical work since childhood to the present day. I know there's so much ground to cover here, but
I know, right? Like every project, yeah.
so much. But if to make it maybe a bit easier, just to narrow it down to a few themes and topics I had in mind, your approach to instrumentation. So the main instruments that you're proficient on, and any cool techniques or sort of signature styles that you've developed on them. Your approach to songwriting, being influenced by medieval music and choral music, because I find that
Yeah.
really fascinating. You don't even see that, uh, even in the most experimental circles of the I guess the New York City brutal prog scene.
Yeah.
You don't really see that too often, which is fascinating. Um, the general musical and artistic culture of New York City, the downtown scene, Brooklyn.
Yeah, the early music does not. Yeah, it's not a big trend. It's still very. I mean, if you go to like used record stores and stuff, I mean, you can still get all of this medieval and Renaissance like vinyl and shit for like $4. It's just pounds and pounds of these records. It's really not hip shit.
Um, Now, speaking of music, as I'm sure anyone who follows you is well aware, you're an incredibly prolific musician. You have many projects under your belt, from bands like Extra Life, Z's, Psalm Zero, etc., to collaborations with musicians like Mick Barr, Colin Marston, Dirty Projectors, really all of the big hitters in the New York City experimental scene, I'd say. And I definitely want to touch on some of these specific projects, particularly Extra Life, in greater detail. But for now, walk us through your musical trajectory and your main musical works, from childhood to the present day. And if you wanted to narrow it down to certain themes and topics, you could focus more on your approach to instrumentation. So the
Mhm.
instruments that you're most proficient on, the any techniques or specific styles that you've honed in on over the years. Your approach to songwriting, the
Mhm.
technicality and eclecticism that we see in your music. The medieval influences, fun and influence. The basically being a musician in the broader context of the New York City downtown scene, the
Okay.
city artistic scene. If you want to touch on any of those on the
Yeah.
intersection, those go into as much
Okay.
like yeah.
So like everything. All right. So yeah, from the trajectory. I mean, I guess like how do we start? So right, like high school, I'm into jazz, and I'm starting to get into this more out there jazz in college. Right. I was into metal as a kid. I'm into like death metal, etc. And I'm getting into classical music a little bit more, but it's mostly from a 20th century post World War II kind of,
Yeah.
like whatever you want to call that, like contemporary classical modern, 20th century. difficult atonal classical music, which you could say is not really classical music in a sense, Western art music after a certain point. And then through that, people were telling me like, oh man, if you're into, because I got into like Arvo Pärt, you know him?
Yeah, I've heard of him. I've never checked out any of his music, but I've heard of him.
How you doing, Raphael?
Yeah, sorry, just interrupt for one brief moment. Our friend Raphael just joined the podcast. Really cool guy. He's gonna be working with Scorpion Movement more frequently now, but he's been working behind the scenes for a while. But he's gonna contribite today. So
nice to meet you. Yeah.
How's it going?
Oh yeah, no, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I was just talking about like how right. So Arvo Pärt, right? So he's like contemporary classical composer, but is like a medievalist, right? So some people were like, oh man, like go further with that. If you check out actual early music, they're like that really does have some stuff in common with contemporary classical music. There are certain things that it has in common that neither of those things have in common with actual classical common practice period. Yeah. Classical music, and I mean, you could really go deep, looking at it as like a pre and post Enlightenment thing, maybe in some philosophical level or aesthetics, But so I'm into all those things, and the thing is, I've been like zigzagging around the whole time, like my progression, like it's really not like a linear narrative, It's not like I mean, you could, there's always a different ways to tell a story, right? But I mean, there's quite a bit of zigzagging, I would say, because, college, I'm playing in like metalish, emo, hardcore kind of thing, but it's not my main serious thing. I'm doing projects that are trying to bring together some no-wave, weirdo indie rock stuff with the classical and the jazz stuff. Then, I mean, big deal is I hook up with the guys from Z's, right? So they're in New York. I'm at Wesleyan, so I'm in Connecticut, right? But I'm like 2 hours out of the city. I meet these guys. I'm like, all right, this is some of the sickest, and they were already like a band. I mean, I was kind of founding member, but it was really just Alex Minchek.
So, sorry, just to interject. So you met the members of Z's that you founded a band at Wesleyan, right?
No, I actually met them. I took a year off of school. Like I thought I wasn't going to go back because like things got a little tricky in my life. So yeah, when I was in New York on a year off, I met Sam Hilmer. And Alex Minchek, and they were kind of doing like a duo. Those are the two saxophonists, the original saxophonists from Z's, and so they were kind of like mixing. I mean, the classical, the avant classical thing, the jazz thing, avant-garde jazz thing, and the like weirdo rock thing. They were doing those. They had this vision for Z's that was gonna be. They had this new vision for what it was gonna be. It wasn't really Z's yet. They were like, we're kind of doing this thing. It's kind of a loose thing. It's a collective, and they wanted to bring me in, and they had this music written that was like highly aggressive, highly complicated music that had saxophones and guitar in it, but did not have improvisation and did not swing and did not have any jazz elements other than the saxophone. And not only was this amazing just stylistically to me, I mean, these guys were like the older cool kids. They were only like 2 or 3 years older than me, but when you're 20, that matters, right? And yeah, I mean, I just felt really grateful to be sort of scooped up by these guys, but I was kind of like a sideman in their thing. And I was like writing stuff, but it was like kind of in the genre of I don't know, it was like within this sort of aesthetic parameters, with what they were doing. So it's kind of like, and so Z's was kind of like the main thing I was doing for early 20s. Now, like in retrospect, I was kind of not developing my own voice the way I maybe could have been, because I was kind of like tagging along with these guys, right? Mm-hmm. But what I got from being in that band was just increasing levels of just power and knowledge, and these experiences, like, because some of these early rehearsals we did, even though we're rehearsing their music, it's like some of these rehearsals, like I had never played in a band that tight and intense ever. And so some of these specific rehearsals I remember where it was almost like traumatizing, but in a positive way. It was like the opposite, like just being like, I can't unknow this now. Like everything I do from now on has to be this tight because that's now the standard, you know? So, but yeah, you know, that was definitely Z's, even though it was the most unique stuff at the time. It was kind of part of this thing in New York that was I mean, there's the whole history in New York music. There's always this avant-garde stuff. And then you got Zorn and there's a particular kind of avant-garde in the 80s and 90s. But in the 2000s, there was this Brooklyn thing.
Yeah.
Kind of the hipster thing, but the sort of the side of that was like actually something real, actual art and music that was like of some substance. And so Z's was kind of part of that, even though it was an anomaly within that. But it was kind of bringing this academic, you know, we're playing off music stands, right? Like reading. I'm spending a lot of time on Z's, which I didn't expect I was going to in the answer, but there must be some reason why I'm doing this. Like we were bringing music stands into like grimy basement shows. The other bands that we were playing with were avant-garde music with guitars, but it was like gnarly, you know, people either not knowing music theory or at least pretending not to know, you know, whatever. So Z's laid this foundation down, and then it was like, but I wasn't really singing. It wasn't my thing exactly. So then, 2006, I decide, you know, I'm going to leave Z's, and I had this image for Extra Life, which is like what I was like, all right, I'm going to take these lessons learned with Z's, right? Using notation in this kind of context, notating the drum parts. Okay, that's a thing. Mm-hmm. And I don't do that with every Extra Life thing. Sometimes the drummers write their own parts for sure, but that's a thing that sometimes happens, and especially in early Extra Life, actually writing out what the drummer plays. Nobody does that in avant rock music. I mean, it's you know,
maybe sorry to interject, but maybe Behold the Octopus. Because I remember they did. I'm pretty sure their music was actually notated beforehand. Like one guy would compose the music and he would write it down on sheet paper, and then he'd give it to everyone else, and they'd have to learn it. Like these insane, super simple compositions.
I know. Yeah, Behold the Octopus, who were very much a part of that scene at the time.
They were definitely part of it.
Yeah, they No, I mean they use notation for sure. I mean but as far as the drums, well, actually, I'm not sure how they did that with drum wise, but to be, you know, with this Extra Life stuff, I shouldn't say no one's doing that, but it's kind of rare to like, you know, to be telling a drummer, not just to show them the music and be like, write a drum part to this and you have the rhythms, but to be like snare, tom, tom, snare, kick, snare, you know, you do that, especially when you're not a drummer writing for drummers doing that, you come up with shit that a drummer would not come up with, because it doesn't, you know, it's not easy to play on the instrument, doesn't come naturally to the instrument. So, you know, that gets into issues with, you know, what it means to be a composer, notation. You know, it's very totalitarian to tell a drummer every single fucking drum to play. A lot of people aren't into that, you know.
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
No, but I mean, I could keep going. Well, maybe you should chime in. But in any case, that was.
I agree that this old, you know, I guess you could say applying the modality of, you know, like Western art music where everything's notated and has to be performed in a specific manner, and there's not that much room for improvisation unless it literally says, you know, improvise here, which is kind of against the spirit of improvisation in a sense. That's not very conducive to drumming in particular, I find, at least, because especially within this more raucous and free flowing music, you know, this more cacophonous, weird abrasive music. You know, the drummer likes to go crazy with the fills and blast beats and just random these abrupt like bursts of sound, and you know, it's really hard to just notate all of that. I mean, that kind of goes against the spirit of it in a sense. I don't know if you agree with me in that regard. I personally like drumming that's a bit more, and obviously I know it depends on the band and on the music and
sure
what we're aiming for. But I do like drumming that's a bit more free in a sense, not just like free jazz or anything like that, but in the sense of the drummer doesn't stick completely to what's or adhere completely to what's been written beforehand. They
sure
like that.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, it depends on the kind of, some of the newer Extra Life stuff, the drummers that I've been working with on the last record, Gilles Chevignet, or that was 2 records ago. And then the last one, David Bodie, and now the new drummer is Cameron Wish. These are all great players, man. I have been, my record with drummers is like, I've only played with the best drummers ever, all tied for the best since I'm very, really, very lucky. The thing is, notating all the drums though, it's like there's a you could call it fussy or precious or something, but if you think about if you're really treating each drum with the kind of respect of just how special the sound is. If you have a piece of music that's 15 minutes long and you don't hear cymbals until minute 11, that is something, man. That is, to treat the cymbals like a big deal that's now happening. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Or to have a whole section that's just rim shot, it's just the rim.
Yeah.
You're dealing with texture in a way where, you're resensitizing people to certain stuff. You know what I mean? It's you start, there's there's no disrespect to any genre, but it's I was listening to some, I can't remember what, some pop punk came on, or that I was hearing in the supermarket or something. And I was the crash, they have a crash going the entire song. And it's no disrespect, but I'm that's, when you think about that, you've got this high wash of metallic, relatively harsh sound going on every beat for an entire song. I'm that's kind of nuts, But when you notate drums, man, you can get into some shit where you're you have some crazy riff, right? This is another thing. When you're writing some really not just rhythmically complicated and harmonically complicated guitar work, in a lot of Extra Life, man. If you have another layer of drums doing more ideas on top of that can just be a soup of ideas, man. But if you have a thing, right, where the drummer's hitting a kick drum on every G, every time there's a G in the riff, they're hitting a kick drum, and every time there's an A flat, they're hitting the snare. That's not creative for the drummer. That's not an added layer of ideas. That's just my original idea, just fortified. It's like coloring book. You know what I mean? It's but you just have the original idea just outlined by the drums, and then it's you don't hear an F sharp until minute 11. Once the F sharps happen, you get a crash. You know what I'm saying? It's that's some shit. No drummer is going to do that. It would be so autistic for a drummer to even want to do that. You have to be controlling them with the technology of notation. And that's a weird, that isn't we're in a band. That is there's a composer and he's telling me what to do. And there's all kinds of, the issues with that, money issues. No one's doing that for free. It's but they have to really love the music to want to do that,
Yeah, like you said earlier, it becomes very totalitarian in a sense when you make the drummer play in this super rigid, autistic manner, just sticking completely to whatever's been noted before. And I would say, and not everyone might agree with me on this, of course, but I would say that it's somewhat antithetical, to be honest, to the spirit of rock, I guess. And I know that's a bit of a...
yes. Oh, it very much is. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
If the spirit of rock can even be identified. I mean, what do you think about that? Is that even...
I don't know about the spirit, but I don't know about the spirit, but the process, it is completely alien to any kind of process that would be considered a rock music thing. It's funny though, I'm using the word totalitarian to get into your boy Evola. I don't know if he's your boy. I just saw you had.
No, he's not. I would say that we, the Scorpion Movement members, bonded a shared interest in it, but not in the sense that we agree with every
Jordan, I can cover this if you want. So no, we do
go ahead, man.
We do explore a lot of different philosophies, and I think I was the one who produced most of the videos covering like Evola and Evolian dynamism. I think it was mostly like an introspection into the actual books, as a divergence from continental philosophy, some of the more esoteric stuff. Necessarily, I think the philosophers that mostly relate to the Scorpion movement are people like Nick Land and Mark Fisher. I think we're more into that accelerationist space than we are into the classical right-wing literature philosopher analyst phase. But I think it was a very interesting thing to explore, particularly because of how important this is to like modern, not only political but like social discourse. Culture as well. It very heavy overlaps.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I've read a little bit of many of his, like several of his books. I like Ride the Tiger the best, but as far as like, just something that I had never, something that I got from reading like just the beginning of one of those Evola books. And this is not his idea. This is like the simplest. This is like not that deep at all. But I just hadn't thought about just that there's a difference between authoritarianism and totalitarianism. I mean, just that like, you can have a supreme sovereign ruler who is essentially a dictator or a king or a Führer or whatever. That guy isn't necessarily going to rule in a totalitarian way. He could micromanage how you take a piss and every word you say, but he might be more chill, even though he could behead everyone. He doesn't behead everyone, shit like that. So it's like, I just got thinking about that this is only to say that I have found that the best music that I've made has been with Extra Life, and it has been, which is why I revived it. Actually, Extra Life was my thing from 2007 to 2013. It's the thing I'm best known for, and then I took a long hiatus from it for various reasons, and then brought it back 3 years ago. But in any case, the setup of that band is authoritarian in the sense that I tell everyone what to do, and if they don't like it, they can leave. That's like cold-blooded way of saying it, but that's what I do. But it doesn't have to be totalitarian. Notating the drums is totalitarian, but some of the time I don't notate the drums. People come up with their own parts, But but I'll decide when, I'll like notate all the drums totalitarian style up till section C, and then I'll be for section C, I need ideas. I don't have the good totalitarian idea. I want to hear your ideas and stuff like that. So I kind of
the idea. Sorry, Jordan. The idea of like an authoritarian leader, whether it is within a band or a system or whatever, actually leaving room for interpretation, and I guess not being too authoritarian in the way that they notate drums and make sure that everything's in order and every single thing doesn't sound out of tune and there's no room for interpretation. The idea of that we're verging into like philosopher king type shit. But
right.
I do get the distinction, and I very much like the comparison that you've made. I can see why out of all of the works of like philosophers like Evola, Ride the Tiger would appeal most to you, because I think a lot of that book focuses on the distinction between this type of autistic micromanaging and the idea of a hierarchy.
Yeah, totally. The other thing I love about, I think it's from Ride the Tiger, I can't remember, but like the line, there's one of these, he keeps talking about, I love this, but I also laugh at. Like, I laugh at it and with it, like it's amusing, but also he's like, a man of a certain type. Like he's always talking about like, like this is not for everyone. It's a man of a certain type. Like that kind of elitism. I kind of like that, in art, just being like, when I hear someone being like, yeah, man, my art's for everyone. I want everyone. It's for the people. I'm like, mine is only for,
It doesn't explicitly say who it is. It just says it's a
right,
type.
exactly.
That's all you need.
Yeah. And it doesn't have to be a man even, but it's fun to say man because it's just all fucking,
when we launched the Scorpion Movement political party, we're going to launch a based aesthetic dictatorship. So democracy, that's going out the window. But in all seriousness, and it's actually interesting that you bring up, the questions of power and leadership in the musical context, because before we started a call, just for the audience, we brushed on people like Moldbug or Curtis Yarvin and these new NRX thinkers, and a big hallmark of those thinkers is that they're quite skeptical of democracy, and they think it's essentially a failed system, that it doesn't really it promotes mediocrity and stagnation rather than meritocracy. And I want to touch. We're going to touch on just actual philosophy and theories in greater detail soon, because we've been talking about music for a long time. But it's quite interesting how that intersects with music actually, and that's actually beginning to have a lot more real world influence, let's say, because of I don't know, Charlie, how to what extent you keep up with American news, like American political news, but if you
less than you'd think.
I find a lot of very high-minded theory people who might read a lot of political philosophy or political theory don't actually have a tremendous interest in the day-to-day political happenings of the world.
There's very little application of what you see on the news to like political theory.
Yeah, because, in a sense, Charlie, I don't know what you think about this, but in a sense, like, I've heard some people talk. I think Deleuze actually talked about this. By the way, I know that you're interested in Deleuze, so we can nerd out about that for a bit. But I think Deleuze actually even said something like, you can't really reduce philosophy to just an intellectual activity, or to something that it serves almost as an adjunct to science. And he was coming up in the context, obviously, of this explosion of analytic philosophy that really began to take over the academy in the 20th century. People like Bertrand Russell and A.J. Ayer, and then Wittgenstein was a part of this for a period, but obviously he changed his beliefs later in life. But what the logical positivists and these types of analytic philosophers think is essentially that, for almost the entirety of the history of Western philosophy, there was this plague of obscurantism and this very mystical, poetic language that they thought was just unnecessary. And so what they do is they have this belief, I think it's called logical atomism, where they reduce all propositions, literally all statements. It's a question of language, like meta-linguistics in a sense, to whether or not they convey a statement that can actually be determined to be either true or false in this binaristic method sense. And so they would say that they would really slam a lot of the big names in continental philosophy and critical theory as charlatans, essentially, because they say there's nothing here that actually helps us attain an understanding of objective reality and the actual the nature and laws of objective reality. Now, I don't think someone needs to read Deleuze or any of these trendy like French thinkers to understand that that's a very limiting position, and it's quite intellectually naive, to be honest. And I think if you ascribe to this logical positivist view, you're really boxing yourself in terms of your actual interaction with the world and or life. But what I wanted to say is, Deleuze's response to that was, the problem with that is that philosophy, theory, and intellectualism is actually it's actually almost an art form in a sense. Like when you're reading philosophy, you're not just reading it to uncover objective facts about the world. I mean, I think that would more so be the realm of science, even though I don't even completely agree with that, because there is definitely this aesthetic and almost mystical component to science, and I want to touch on that if we have time. But he says you're actually reading it almost to get this aesthetic pleasure, maybe more.
Well, I know somewhere he says that thought does not necessarily even tend toward truth, right? I mean, he's talking about cultivating thought, for the sake of thought, and thought as cultivating joy, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And then I guess and he also talks about how his thought is, I mean, this I understand a little less, but how he's talking about it's not about what's true, it's about what's useful.
Yeah.
Okay. That is a little harder for me to get what he means by that, because it seems like his stuff is not useful either. But unless you think of utility of joy, certainly gives me a lot of joy. And I mean Deleuze's work. I mean, I noticed things in reality, the smooth and the striated and stuff like that that resonates with what I actually see, and there is some with musical composition, like his stuff about the smooth and the striated. That has actual implications for how I might write melodies and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But
sorry to interject, but what he says is, I used the word aesthetic pleasure, but even then, I don't think that's pleasure is quite the right word to use, because I think there's this common misconception that I'd say the average person holds, the average music listener who's not for lack of a better term, was not quite as obsessive about music that we might be, where they tend to, they tend to judge music and apprehend it based on how, just the degree of like instant pleasure that it provides them. Is it danceable? Is it kind of smooth on the ears? But, I think much of the spirit of great profound music is actually completely opposed to that in a sense. It's about, abrasion. Like this might sound a bit pretentious, but there's